The gunshot echoed across Whispering Creek, silencing even the birds that summer morning in 1878. Blood soaked into the parched earth of Main Street as Rosco Thorne stood over the body, his expression as hard as granite while townsfolk gathered in stunned silence. Without a word, he holstered his revolver, mounted his stallion, and rode toward his lonely homestead at the edge of town, leaving behind whispers that would follow him for years to come. Pearl Finley watched from the doorway of her father's general store, a hand pressed to her mouth. She had only been in Whispering Creek for 3 days, having arrived from Boston to help her aging father with his business. The violence was shocking to her Eastern sensibilities, yet something in the cowboy's eyes, not coldness, but profound sorrow, stayed with her long after he disappeared from view. "That's Rosco Thorne," her father, Harold Finley, said quietly as he joined her at the doorway. "Best rancher in the territory, never known him to draw unless forced." "What happened?" Pearl asked, unable to tear her eyes from the lifeless form being carried away by the undertaker. "That's Wade Burnett, been threatening Rosco for months over water rights." "Guess he finally made good on his threats." Harold shook his head. "Sheriff Donovan saw the whole thing, self-defense, plain and simple. Burnett drew first." Pearl nodded but couldn't reconcile the violence with the glimpse of pain she'd seen in the cowboy's eyes. "Does Mr. Thorne have family?" "None to speak of. Wife and daughter died of fever 5 years back. Lives alone at Silvergrass Ranch. Keeps to himself mostly, but always been fair in his dealings." Harold turned back to his store. "Come on now, there's inventory to sort." The following days brought a flurry of activity as Pearl settled into life in Whispering Creek. She organized her father's chaotic bookkeeping system, rearranged merchandise for better display, and gradually met the townspeople who frequented the store. Everyone had something to say about Rosco Thorne: his fairness as an employer, his skill with horses, his generosity during hard winters. Yet all mentioned how he'd grown increasingly withdrawn since the shooting. "Hasn't spoken a word to anyone," said Martha Willoughby, the postmistress, as she purchased sewing notions. "Comes to town for supplies, nods his head in greeting, but not a single word passes his lips." "Grief does strange things to a man," added Dr. Samuel Wilson, who had stopped in for tobacco. "First his family, now this, some wounds cut deeper than flesh." Pearl found herself thinking about the silent cowboy frequently. She remembered how her mother had always said that food could mend what words couldn't reach. The memory sparked an idea. That Saturday, Pearl rose before dawn and began baking, using her mother's treasured recipe for apple pie. The kitchen filled with the comforting aroma of cinnamon and baked apples as she worked, her thoughts drifting to the troubled man who lived alone with his ghosts. "Where are you off to?" Harold asked when he found her wrapping the still warm pie in a clean cloth. "Silvergrass Ranch," Pearl replied simply. "Mr. Thorne shouldn't be alone with his thoughts." Harold's weathered face softened. "You've got your mother's heart, Pearl, but Rosco might not welcome company." "Then I won't be company," she said, placing the wrapped pie in a basket. "I'll just leave this on his porch." The ride to Silvergrass Ranch took nearly an hour. Pearl borrowed her father's gentle mare, following directions from the local livery owner. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling grasslands as the ranch came into view, a well-maintained 2-story house surrounded by sturdy outbuildings. Corrals filled with fine horses, and a small creek winding through the property. Pearl approached cautiously, relieved to see no sign of the rancher. She tethered the mare to a hitching post and walked to the porch, setting the basket down carefully. She hesitated, then pulled a small note from her pocket and tucked it beside the pie. "Sometimes sweetness helps bitter moments pass. Pearl Finley." She was halfway to her horse when the front door opened. Rosco Thorne stood in the doorway, tall and imposing in simple ranch clothes, his face partially obscured by several days' growth of beard. His eyes, deep-set and gray as storm clouds, met hers with a question he wouldn't voice. Pearl felt her cheeks flush. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne." "I've brought you a pie, apple. I hope you enjoy it." When he made no response, she added, "I won't disturb you further," and turned to leave. His boots made little sound on the wooden porch as he crossed to retrieve the basket. Though he didn't speak, he nodded once acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude. It was enough for Pearl. She mounted her father's mare and rode away, feeling his gaze follow her until she crested the hill that would take her back to town. "Did he say anything?" Harold asked when she returned. "No," Pearl replied, hanging her bonnet on its peg. "But he accepted the pie. Sometimes that's enough to begin with." The following Sunday found Pearl once again riding toward Silvergrass Ranch, this time with a fresh cherry pie nestled in her basket. She had spent the week helping in the store, getting to know the rhythms of Whispering Creek, and thinking about the silent rancher. She'd spotted him in town only once, purchasing supplies at Jensen's feed store. He'd acknowledged her presence with a slight nod before mounting his horse and riding away. This time when Pearl approached the ranch, she found the previously returned basket sitting on the porch railing, scrubbed clean. She smiled at this small communication as she left the cherry pie in its place, again with a simple note. "Cherry for cheer, Pearl Finley." She didn't see Rosco that day, but as she rode away, she noticed fresh cut firewood stacked neatly near her father's home on the outskirts of town, more than they could use in a month. No note, no explanation, but she knew it was his way of saying thank you. For 6 consecutive Sundays, Pearl baked different pies: blackberry, peach, rhubarb, custard, mince, and blueberry, each accompanied by a brief note. Sometimes she caught glimpses of Rosco working with his horses or mending fences as she approached, but he always disappeared inside the house before she reached the porch. The basket was always returned, clean and waiting, and small gifts would appear at the Finley home throughout the week: fresh eggs, a fine cut of beef, a jar of honey, wildflowers in a hand-carved vase. Word of Pearl's Sunday ritual spread through town, earning her both admiration and concern. "You're wasting your time," warned Olivia Jensen, the feed store owner's daughter. "Rosco Thorne's heart died with his wife. Everyone knows that." "I'm not trying to win his heart," Pearl insisted, though she couldn't deny the flutter in her chest whenever she thought of him. "I'm simply being neighborly." "Well, it's the talk of the town," Martha Willoughby informed her with obvious delight. "Some say he's sweet on you but too prideful to speak after what happened." Pearl dismissed such gossip, but found herself taking extra care with her appearance each Sunday, wearing her prettiest dresses and arranging her auburn hair just so, despite telling herself it was merely respect for the Sabbath. On the 7th Sunday, a late summer thunderstorm rolled in as Pearl approached Silvergrass Ranch. The sky darkened ominously, and fat raindrops began to fall as she hurried up the path to the porch, her butterscotch pie covered protectively. The rain intensified suddenly, becoming a downpour that made returning immediately impossible. Pearl hesitated on the porch, looking at the closed door. Lightning flashed, followed by a thunderclap that made her jump. She knocked tentatively, then more firmly when there was no response. The door opened slowly. Rosco stood before her, cleanly shaven now, dressed in a simple white shirt and dark trousers. His eyes moved from her face to the basket in her hands, then to the storm behind her. "I'm sorry to intrude," Pearl said quickly. "The storm, I was hoping I might wait it out here on your porch." He stepped back and opened the door wider, inviting her in without words. Pearl hesitated only briefly before entering, bringing the scent of rain and butterscotch pie into the warmth of his home. The interior of the house surprised her. She had expected a bachelor's sparse accommodations, but found instead a well-maintained home with simple, quality furnishings. A bookshelf lined one wall, filled with volumes of history, poetry, and agricultural texts. The fireplace held a small fire that took the damp chill from the air, and everything was meticulously clean. "Your home is lovely," she said, standing awkwardly in the center of the room, water dripping from her skirts. Rosco disappeared into another room, returning with a towel which he offered her. His fingers brushed hers in the exchange, causing an unexpected warmth to spread through her. He gestured toward a chair near the fire, then busied himself putting a kettle on the stove. Thank you, Pearl said, drying her hair as best she could before setting the towel aside. I've brought butterscotch pie today. My father says it's my best. He nodded, then moved about the kitchen with efficiency, preparing 2 cups of coffee. The silence between them was punctuated only by the crackling fire, the drumming rain, and occasional thunder. Strangely, it didn't feel uncomfortable to Pearl. There was a peacefulness in his presence that required no words. When the coffee was ready, he brought her a cup, then cut 2 slices of pie and placed them on plates. They sat before the fire, the storm raging outside, eating pie and drinking coffee in companionable silence. Pearl noticed a photograph on the mantel, a beautiful woman with a small girl on her lap, both smiling brightly. Rosco followed her gaze, and a shadow passed over his features. "Your family?" Pearl asked softly, immediately regretting the question when pain flashed in his eyes. To her surprise, he nodded, then rose and took the photograph from the mantel. He handed it to her gently, as if passing a precious and fragile thing. "They're beautiful," Pearl said truthfully, studying the happy faces. What were their names? For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the storm outside. Then, in a voice rough from disuse, he spoke his first words to her: "Rebecca and little Sarah." The words seemed pulled from somewhere deep inside him, painful in their emergence. Pearl looked up, meeting his eyes. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but a softening. He took the photograph back, tracing the faces with a fingertip before returning it to its place of honor. They finished their pie in silence, but it was different now, a silence chosen rather than imposed. When the rain finally slowed to a gentle patter, Pearl knew it was time to leave. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Thorne," she said, gathering her things. "Rosco," he said, the word coming easier this time. "Just Rosco," Pearl smiled. "Rosco, then. I'm glad for the storm that brought me to your door." He walked her to the porch, where her horse waited patiently beneath the overhang. Before she could mount, he touched her arm lightly. "The pies," he said, voice gaining strength with each word. "They help, thank you." Pearl's heart swelled with unexpected emotion. "Then I'll keep bringing them," she promised. He helped her onto her horse, his strong hands steady at her waist. As she rode away, she glanced back to see him standing on the porch, watching her go. For the first time since she'd begun her Sunday ritual, he raised his hand in farewell. The following week brought a subtle but noticeable change in Roscoe's behavior. He came to town more frequently, no longer avoiding interaction. While still a man of few words, he began to speak when necessary: brief greetings, polite requests at stores, even short conversations with longtime acquaintances. "Whatever magic you've worked with those pies," Harold told Pearl with a wink, "it seems to be reaching the man." Pearl busied herself with inventory, hiding her pleased smile. "There's no magic in baked goods, Father, just comfort." "Call it what you will," he replied, "but Rosco Thorne spoke a full paragraph to me yesterday about rain barrels. That's more words than I've heard from him in 6 months combined." Sunday arrived clear and bright, with autumn's first hints coloring the leaves. Pearl's pecan pie, her most complicated recipe, cooled on the windowsill as she changed into her blue calico dress, the one that matched her eyes. She was pinning her hair when a commotion outside drew her to the window. A crowd had gathered in the street. At its center stood Sheriff Donovan and 3 rough-looking men Pearl didn't recognize. One man, tall with a pockmarked face, gesticulated angrily. "I'm telling you, Sheriff, Wade Burnett was my brother and Thorne murdered him in cold blood. We've come for justice." Pearl hurried outside, joining her father, who stood watching from their porch. "Trouble," Harold muttered. "Burnett's brothers from over Dry Creek Way, bad sorts, all of them." Sheriff Donovan maintained a calm exterior. "Mr. Burnett, I've explained the situation. Your brother drew first." There were a dozen witnesses. It was clean self-defense. "Witnesses from this town protecting one of their own," the man spat. "We want Thorne. Where is he?" "I'm right here." The quiet voice cut through the tension as Rosco stepped from the livery stable, his stance relaxed but alert. "Whatever you have to say, Burnett, say it to me directly." Pearl's heart raced as she watched the confrontation unfold. The three Burnett brothers turned to face Rosco, hatred plain on their faces. "You killed our brother," the pockmarked man snarled. "We're here to make you pay." "Your brother tried to kill me first," Rosco said evenly. "I'm sorry for your loss, but he made his choice." "Sorry don't cut it," the shortest brother said, his hand hovering near his holstered pistol. "Only your blood will settle this debt." Sheriff Donovan stepped between them. "That's enough. This is a peaceable town. If you've got a legitimate grievance, take it to the circuit judge. Otherwise, I suggest you move along." For a tense moment, it seemed the Burnetts might ignore the sheriff's warning. Then the pockmarked man spat in the dirt. "This ain't over, Thorne, not by a long shot. We'll be watching and waiting." They mounted their horses and rode slowly out of town, casting threatening glances back at Rosco and the gathered townspeople. As the crowd dispersed, Rosco's eyes met Pearl's across the distance. Something passed between them: concern, reassurance, connection before he nodded briefly and walked back into the livery. "Those men mean trouble," Harold said grimly. "Burnett's never let go of a grudge." Pearl's hands trembled slightly as she wrapped the pecan pie later that afternoon. The confrontation had shaken her more than she cared to admit, not for her own safety but for Rosco's. The hatred in the Burnett brothers' eyes had been palpable, dangerous. She hesitated before setting out, wondering if she should delay her visit. But the thought of breaking their Sunday ritual now, especially after the morning's events, seemed wrong. Rosco might need a friendly face more than ever. When she arrived at Silvergrass Ranch, she found Rosco on the porch, a rifle across his lap. He set it aside as she approached, rising to help her down from her horse. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice low. "Not safe with the Burnetts looking for trouble." "I wasn't followed," Pearl assured him, handing him the basket. "And I wouldn't let them frighten me away from bringing your pie. It's pecan today." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "My favorite," he said, then gestured to the porch chairs. "Would you stay for a while?" Pearl nodded, settling into the offered chair. They sat in comfortable silence as Rosco cut slices of the pie, serving hers first. The golden afternoon light cast long shadows across the ranch yard where horses grazed peacefully. "I was married once," Pearl said suddenly, surprising herself with the admission. "In Boston, his name was Thomas. He died of pneumonia 2 years ago." Rosco looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps seeing for the first time the shadow of grief she too carried. "I'm sorry." "It was a good marriage, if brief," she continued. "We had a small bookshop. I sold it after. Came west to start fresh with father. And to bring pies to troubled strangers," Rosco added, that almost smile returning. "Only the ones who look like they need them," Pearl replied, matching his lighter tone. They talked, then really talked, as the sun began its descent. Rosco spoke of his ranch, his plans to expand his horse breeding operation, his love of the open country. Pearl shared stories of Boston, her father's decision to move west for his health, her adjustment to frontier life. Neither mentioned the Burnetts again, though Pearl noticed how Rosco's eyes regularly scanned the horizon, vigilant even in conversation. As twilight approached, Rosco insisted on escorting her back to town. "Not safe for you to ride alone with those men about," he said, brooking no argument as he saddled his horse. They rode side by side, the conversation continuing easily now that the initial barrier had been broken. Pearl found herself laughing at Rosco's dry observations about town personalities, while he listened intently to her descriptions of eastern cities he'd never seen. At the edge of town, he slowed his horse. "I'll watch until you're safely home," he said. Pearl nodded, understanding his caution. "Will you come to Sunday dinner next week? Father would enjoy the company, and I promise food beyond just pie." Rosco considered, then nodded. "I'd like that." She smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. "Until then." As she rode the final distance home, Pearl reflected on the day's events with mixed emotions. The threat of the Burnett brothers cast a shadow over Whispering Creek, but the deepening connection with Rosco brought light that seemed to balance the darkness. The week passed in a flurry of activity. News spread that the Burnett brothers had been seen at various locations around the territory, apparently making good on their promise to watch and wait. Sheriff Donovan increased his patrols, and many ranchers, including Rosco, kept their rifles closer at hand. Despite the tension, or perhaps because of it, Rosco came to town almost daily. He began taking his meals at the small restaurant next to the general store, often timing his visits to coincide with Pearl's break from her work. Their conversations grew longer, deeper, touching on books they'd both read, dreams they still held, and the quiet understanding of shared loss. "You've brought him back to life," Dr. Wilson commented when he caught Pearl watching Rosco through the store window. "Not many would have had the patience." "I didn't do anything special," Pearl protested. The doctor chuckled. "Sometimes the most special thing is simply showing up, my dear, consistency, proving that not everything good in life disappears." Sunday dinner at the Finley home became a new tradition. Rosco arrived promptly at noon, freshly shaved and dressed in his best clothes, a bottle of wine or small gift in hand. Harold took to him immediately, the two men finding common ground in discussions of business, ranching, and local politics. Pearl watched their growing friendship with satisfaction, even as she found her own feelings for Rosco deepening beyond simple compassion. She caught herself looking forward to their conversations, noticing the way his eyes crinkled when he was amused, how his hands moved expressively when he spoke of things he cared about. By late October, with autumn fully established across the prairie, Pearl realized she had fallen in love with Rosco Thorne. The knowledge both thrilled and frightened her. She had not expected to love again after Thomas, certainly not a man so different from her scholarly first husband. Yet there it was a quiet, steady love that had grown from compassion to friendship to something more profound. Whether Rosco shared these feelings remained unclear. He treated her with growing warmth and obvious respect, sought out her company, and listened to her opinions with genuine interest. Yet he maintained a certain reserve, as if holding part of himself apart from their deepening connection. "He's afraid," Harold told her one evening after Rosco had left following dinner. "Not of the Burnetts, though that situation remains troubling, but of caring too deeply again. Of losing someone else he loves." "I haven't asked him for anything," Pearl said softly. "You haven't needed to," her father replied. "Your heart shows in your eyes, daughter, and his responds even if he doesn't say the words." The first snow of the season arrived in early November, blanketing Whispering Creek in pristine white. Pearl woke to a transformed world, the harsh edges of the frontier softened by winter's touch. She was preparing a chicken pot pie for Sunday dinner when urgent knocking at the door startled her. Sheriff Donovan stood on their porch, his expression grim. "Miss Finley, is Rosco here?" "No," she replied, wiping flour from her hands. "He's expected for dinner at noon. What's happened?" "The Burnett brothers," the sheriff said, stepping inside. "They were spotted riding towards Silvergrass Ranch early this morning. I sent my deputy out there, but he's not back yet. I'm gathering men to ride out." Pearl's heart lurched. "I'm coming with you." "No, Miss Finley, it could be dangerous. I'm coming," she repeated firmly, already reaching for her coat. "Father, can you manage here?" Harold nodded, concern etched on his features. "Be careful, Pearl." Within 20 minutes, Pearl rode with Sheriff Donovan and 5 armed townsmen towards Silvergrass Ranch. The snow made travel slow, but Pearl barely noticed the cold, her thoughts fixed on Rosco and the danger he might face. Smoke was visible before the ranch came into view, not the normal thin stream from a chimney, but thick, black plumes that spoke of destruction. As they crested the final hill, Pearl gasped at the sight before them. The barn was ablaze, flames licking hungrily at the wooden structure despite the snow. Several horses ran loose in the pasture, clearly released from the burning building. Of the Burnetts there was no sign, but near the house, 2 figures were locked in desperate combat, Rosco and the pockmarked Burnett brother, wrestling in the snow for control of a knife. Sheriff Donovan and the others spurred their horses forward. Pearl followed, terror gripping her heart as she watched Burnett gain momentary advantage, raising the knife high. A shot rang out not from the approaching riders, but from the direction of the house. Burnett jerked backward, the knife falling from his grasp as he collapsed into the blood-stained snow. Deputy Collins emerged from behind a water trough, rifle in hand. "Other two fled when they saw me coming," he called to the sheriff. "This one wouldn't quit." Pearl didn't wait for the men to reach the scene. She slid from her horse and ran to Rosco, who had risen to his knees, one hand pressed to his side where blood seeped through his shirt. "Rosco," she cried, falling to her knees beside him, "how badly are you hurt?" He looked up at her, pain and confusion in his eyes. "Pearl, what are you doing here?" "Saving you, apparently," she said, fighting tears as she examined his wound. "Though the deputy did the actual saving, let me see." The knife had cut through his shirt and sliced his side, but the wound, while bleeding freely, didn't appear life-threatening. Pearl tore strips from her petticoat to create a temporary bandage while Sheriff Donovan organized men to fight the barn fire and search for the other Burnett brothers. "They came at dawn," Rosco explained as she worked, his voice tight with pain. "Set fire to the barn as a distraction. Would have burned the house too if Deputy Collins hadn't arrived when he did." "Don't talk," Pearl instructed, securing the makeshift bandage. "We need to get you to Dr. Wilson." "My horses, the men will round them up," she assured him. "Your life matters more than property, Rosco Thorne." Something in her voice made him look at her sharply, his gray eyes searching her face. Whatever he saw there silenced any further protest. With help from two of the townsmen, they got Rosco onto a horse and started the slow journey back to Whispering Creek. Pearl rode beside him, watchful for any sign that his condition was worsening. The barn continued to burn behind them, too far gone to save despite the efforts to douse the flames. "They won't stop," Rosco said quietly as they rode. "Not until I'm dead or they are." "Then we'll have to make sure it's not you," Pearl replied with more confidence than she felt. "The sheriff will find them." Rosco shook his head slightly. "This isn't your fight, Pearl. You should stay clear of me until it's settled." "That's not your decision to make," she said firmly. "I choose my own path and I choose to stand with you." He fell silent at that, but his hand found hers briefly, squeezing with surprising strength before returning to grip the saddle horn. Dr. Wilson was waiting when they reached town, alerted by Harold of the potential need for his services. He ushered Rosco directly into his office, shooing Pearl out despite her protests. "I'll send for you when I'm finished," he promised. "Go home and make some of that tea you're famous for. He'll need it for strength after the blood loss." Pearl paced her father's kitchen for what seemed like hours before Dr. Wilson's young assistant arrived to summon her. She grabbed her freshly made pot of herbal tea and hurried to the doctor's office, heart pounding with anxiety. She found Rosco sitting up on the examination table, shirtless with bandages wrapped around his torso. His face was pale but composed, and he managed a small smile when she entered. "Not as bad as it looked," he told her. "Doc says I'll be sore for a week or two, but no lasting damage." "He'll need rest and careful watching," Dr. Wilson added, washing his hands in a basin. "The wound is clean, but infection is always a risk, and he shouldn't be alone, not with those Burnett brothers still out there." "He can stay with us," Pearl said immediately. "We have the spare room and I can tend to his wound." Rosco began to protest, but Dr. Wilson cut him off. "That's an excellent solution. I'll help you get him settled." An hour later, Rosco was installed in the Finleys' guest room, propped up on pillows and looking distinctly uncomfortable with the arrangement. Pearl brought him tea and a light meal, setting everything on the bedside table. "You don't have to do this," he said as she adjusted his pillows. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," Pearl replied. She hesitated, then finished softly, "You're important to me." His expression softened. A commotion outside interrupted whatever he had been about to say. Pearl moved to the window to see Sheriff Donovan riding into town with two men bound on horses behind him, the remaining Burnett brothers, finally captured. "The sheriff got them," she reported, relief washing through her. "It's over, Rosco." He closed his eyes briefly. "Good. Though they have cousins who might take up their cause." "Stop borrowing trouble," Pearl admonished gently. "Rest now, we can talk more tomorrow." Rosco recovered quickly under Pearl's attentive care. The Burnett brothers were transported to the territorial prison to await trial for attempted murder and arson, and life in Whispering Creek gradually returned to normal, except that nothing was quite the same for Pearl and Rosco. The crisis had broken down the final barriers between them, creating an intimacy neither had expected. Though Rosco returned to Silvergrass Ranch once Dr. Wilson deemed him well enough, he rode into town daily, spending most of his free time at the Finley home. Together, they planned the rebuilding of his barn, with Pearl's practical suggestions improving on his original design. She accompanied him to select new horses to replace those lost in the fire, her eye for quality surprising the dealers who had expected to bargain only with Rosco. As December arrived, bringing holiday preparations to Whispering Creek, Pearl continued her Sunday pie tradition, though now Rosco shared the dessert with her at the ranch rather than receiving it in solitude. "I've been thinking," he said one snowy Sunday as they sat before his fireplace, empty pie plates beside them, "about what you said when I was hurt." "I said many things," Pearl replied, watching his face carefully, "most of which you should have heeded sooner." A smile tugged at his lips. "You said I was important to you." Her cheeks warmed, but she held his gaze. "You are, when Rebecca died," he said slowly. "I thought that part of my life was over. The part where someone mattered more than my next breath, where seeing someone smile could make even the worst day bearable." He reached for her hand, enfolding it in his larger one. "I never expected to find that again, never wanted to if I'm honest. The risk seemed too great." Pearl's heart quickened. "And now I find that not risking is the greater loss," he said simply. "You brought life back to me, Pearl. One pie at a time, one Sunday at a time, until I remembered what it was to look forward to tomorrow." Tears pricked at Pearl's eyes. "I only did what felt right." "You did what no one else would have thought to do," he corrected. "You saw past the silence to the man beneath." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, worn velvet box. "This was my mother's," he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band set with a single pearl. "I'd be honored if you would wear it." Pearl stared at the ring, then at Roscoe's face, seeing in it all the hope and vulnerability he had hidden for so long. "Are you certain?" she asked softly. "I'm not Rebecca." "No," he agreed. "You're Pearl, the woman who brought sweetness back into a bitter life. The woman I've grown to love more deeply than I believed possible." She smiled through her tears, extending her hand. "Then yes, with all my heart, yes." The ring slipped onto her finger as if made for her. Rosco drew her close, his kiss gentle at first, then deepening as she responded with all the love that had grown in her heart these past months. They were married on Christmas Eve in Whispering Creek's small church, decorated with pine boughs and candles for the holiday. Harold Finley gave his daughter away with tears in his eyes and joy in his heart, and Dr. Wilson stood as Roscoe's best man. The entire town attended, celebrating not just the union of two beloved community members, but the healing that love had brought to a man many had feared was lost to grief. Spring found Pearl and Rosco settled at Silvergrass Ranch, the new barn completed and filled with promising young horses. Harold joined them often for Sunday dinners, his health improving with the joy his daughter's happiness brought him. Pearl still baked pies each Sunday. Apple remained Roscoe's favorite, but now they shared them together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson. Sometimes they spoke of the future, of children they hoped for, of dreams for the ranch. Other times they sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, content in each other's presence. "I never thanked you properly," Rosco said one such evening, the scent of apple and cinnamon drifting between them. "For what?" Pearl asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. "For being stubborn enough to keep bringing pies to a man who wouldn't speak," he replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. "For seeing something worth saving when I'd given up." Pearl smiled, thinking of those first silent Sundays and the journey that had followed. "I saw a good man in pain," she said simply. "And I had pies to bake," he laughed, the sound still new enough to delight her. "Is that all it was, excess baked goods?" "Well," she admitted, turning to face him with mischief in her eyes, "I might have noticed how handsome you looked on that horse." Mercenary woman, he teased, pulling her into his embrace. Using pastry to ensnare an unsuspecting rancher. It worked, didn't it? She murmured against his lips. Thank God it did, Rosco whispered before claiming her mouth in a kiss that tasted of apples, cinnamon, and the sweet promise of all their tomorrows. As summer returned to Whispering Creek, Pearl's condition became apparent to all. She moved through the ranch with a gentle radiance, one hand often resting on the swell of her growing child. Rosco hovered nearby, torn between protectiveness and pride, his eyes rarely leaving his wife as they prepared the nursery in what had once been his lonely home. Boy or girl? Harold asked during one Sunday visit, watching his daughter arrange wildflowers in a vase. Girl, Pearl said confidently. Rosco thinks boy, but I know better. Either way, Rosco said, entering with more firewood though the summer evening was warm, the child will be loved beyond measure. Pearl caught his gaze, the understanding between them needing no words. Their child would grow surrounded by stories of those who came before Rebecca and Sarah Thomas, Pearl's mother, but also immersed in the love that had healed two wounded hearts and created something new and precious from shared pain. In September, as golden light slanted across the newly harvested fields, Pearl gave birth to twins, a girl with Roscoe's gray eyes and a boy with Pearl's auburn hair. They named them Hope and Thomas, honoring both future and past. As Pearl watched Rosco cradle their children with hands that had once seemed permanently clenched in grief, she marveled at life's unexpected turns. From that first gunshot on a dusty street to this moment of perfect joy, a journey that began with a silent man, a grieving woman, and a simple apple pie left on a porch one Sunday morning.